guys, so I'm here today to film my review / discussion video of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I read this book as a part of the Feminist Orchestra book club, which I started, this being our book for April and our second book all round. I actually think this book was a really good follow-up to the last book, and it really developed on that, kind of took us back to some slightly more historical feminism from about 90 years ago, and also made me really excited for what we're going to be reading next and what we're going to be encountering next. If you are interested, the book we're reading just now in May is Alice Walker's You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down, which is a collection of fictional short stories. But back to this book. My edition is the Oxford World Classic, and this edition binds up two of Virginia Woolf's essays, one being A Room of One's Own and the other being The Three Guineas. So like you might have gathered, A Room of One's Own is an essay. It's a sort of stream of consciousness narrative essay plotting the thought process and the musings of Virginia Woolf on the topic of women and writing. Throughout the essay, she explores both her own experiences as a woman in the late 19th and early 20th century. It discusses the wealth of writing on women by men, the history or lack thereof of female writers, and why it is more difficult for women to take part in kind of creative and academic pursuits like writing. The essay itself is split into 6 parts. The first part or chapter is very slow. It's probably the chapter that took me the longest to get through. It's probably the least powerful, the least full of thought. It does serve as a reasonable introduction to the essay, and although it probably could have been a little bit shorter, there was some kind of necessary establishing points in there that set up for the rest of the essay. There was one line in the first chapter that I particularly liked though, and did make me think that I was going to enjoy this book as I did, which was that a famous library has been cursed by a woman is a matter of complete indifference to a famous library, which is a comment on Virginia Woolf being stopped from entering this famous library because she is a woman and doesn't have a man with her or written permission from a man to enter. And I really do enjoy those sort of little witticisms and observations that Virginia Woolf kind of scatters throughout this book. She is a very intelligent and clever woman, and the way she writes is very intelligent, and although I may not have agreed with all of her points, they were presented in very much a discursive fashion, so that to me it didn't really affect my overall reading if I disagreed with her on a minor point, because the overarching point, I was like, yes, I feel you, and it was really amazing to read a woman writing about this 90 years ago. The overarching point is in the title, and that is that women require a room of one's own to write. This is a comment on the fact that women, historically and in Virginia Woolf's times, were far less financially independent. In fact, quite often had no money of their own, didn't have the same opportunities to work and earn their own money. I mean, in lots of historical societies we know women weren't even really allowed to have money or property or their own space. Women were also excluded from the same kind of schooling that men got, so they weren't exposed in the same way to literature and language and opportunities to delve further into that. Obviously, this isn't just an issue faced by women. This kind of lack of financial independence and in requirement for money to open up free time and the opportunities to pursue creative pursuits like writing and academia and art or whatever you're talking about, have for equally as long as they have excluded women, excluded those of lower incomes and the working classes, which therein lies a double problem if you are a woman of the working classes. You really didn't stand a chance, did you? Although Virginia Woolf doesn't delve into the topic of class, she does briefly mention it and acknowledge that it's a problem, not just suffered by women as a whole, but this essay is on women because it's making a really astute observation about women regardless of class, although that's sometimes being a double-edged sword, being excluded from writing, and that's why we have so little historical female writing. Because of this lack of female writers, Virginia Woolf also observes what I'm sure a lot of us are able to see, that any sort of history of women or observations on the behaviour and inner thoughts of women are made by men in literature. So all of the history is written by men, all of the literature is written by men, and women, although included within this, are not given their own voice. They are spoken about on the behalf of by men. I can certainly agree with this as a historian myself. History is definitely dominated by the male voice. History is told to us by men. And Virginia Woolf does top off this essay by encouraging all the women who are listening to her present this essay or reading this essay to go out there and make money and contribute to the writing of women. It's a really logical, well-argued essay. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, few points I didn't really agree with, and I noticed other people in the Goodreads group felt this way as well, which were points like Virginia Woolf's definitely a little bit disparaging of anger and kind of passionate emotion or passionate negative emotion when writing. She feels very much that writers should kind of be very unbiased and sensible, and that's what creates true writing. And she doesn't really encourage anger. She seems to see it as quite an irrational emotion, which I don't agree with. Anger can of course be irrational, but it is often a very rational reaction and emotion to have to certain situations, especially oppression. And it can actually inspire very logical and astute observations and very radical and important movements and changes. So, you know, I'm all for a good bit of rational anger, but like I said, it doesn't really affect my overall appreciation of the essay. It is from 90 years ago, certainly not perfect, and I probably would expect slightly different trains of thought from somebody writing a feminist essay today, but then times are very different. Not for everybody. I mean, the issues in this book are still relevant. And I think that's important to observe. Although women are a lot more financially independent, especially in the Western world, it's important to acknowledge things like the pay gap, which is a very real phenomenon that means women are getting paid less, are going into lower paid jobs, aren't receiving the same kind of promotion or high level positions as men, so are still earning a lot less than men as a whole. And also that in many other countries, women are still prevented from working and having a job and being financially independent and being independent from men and from having an education, which is absolutely appalling. And I think that's the takeaway from this book for me, that Virginia Woolf's essay is very much something that you can adapt and transpose into modern day to fit with modern day feminist issues that in many ways have taken on new shape and new form, but at the basis level still remain the same. I think we can definitely learn a lot from this book, and I'm really glad we read it as a second book for the Feminist Orchestra, because I think it's a really important piece of literature when learning and discussing feminism. And if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend it. It's under 100 pages. After the first chapter, which was slightly slower, I found myself reading it quite quickly, although there was a lot of ideas in there, and I could probably benefit from a reread, and I might observe more things I agree with and maybe disagree with and just get a little bit more from it, because there's a lot in there. I do think it was very readable. I think the way she writes non-fiction is very accessible. So generally speaking, I liked this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm definitely going to be reading more by Virginia Woolf, probably The Three Guineas next, which I think is more of a discussion on politics in general. So I'm excited to see what she says in there and maybe learn a little bit more about the 1920s when she was writing these essays. Do let me know if you have any thoughts on this book. I definitely want to continue the discussion, although I have been really enjoying keeping up with people's thoughts on the Goodreads group. I think people have had so many insightful things to say about the book and their own really astute observations. I'm also really looking forward to discussing the future books with you all as well. Before I go, however, I would like to leave you on a final note from a little bit later on in the book, which follows on from the earlier quote I read to you, and that is, "Lock up your libraries if you like, but there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind."